Good evening. This is my preaching on Jonah 6.3 video presentation. So, first, let me start off. This has been an exciting class. Thank you, Professor Otto, for everything. And let me start with this. Hello. For this oral review, I want to focus on one significant observation from my Workshop 5 inductive paper on Jonah 4 1 through 11, along with the 4 questions I asked in relation to that observation. The observation I chose is this: Jonah possesses correct theology about God, but his heart resists the implications of the theology. I chose this observation because it captures the central tension of Jonah chapter 4. In verse 2, Jonah accurately describes God as a gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. The description reflects God's self-revelation in Exodus 34:6. Jonah's theology is correct. However, instead of rejoicing that God has shown mercy to Nineveh, Jonah becomes angry and even asks God to take his life. This disconnect between what Jonah knows about God and how he responds to God's actions is critical for understanding this passage. From this observation, I asked 4 types of questions. The first one is a rational question. A second one is a modal question. Next is a definitional question and a implicational question. The rational question I asked was, why does Jonah react with anger instead of gratitude when Nineveh repents? This is a question that many listeners naturally have when reading this passage. Jonah's response feels unexpected and unsettling. The question helps listeners wrestle with the reality that agreeing with God's character and theory does not always mean we are willing to accept how God chooses to act in practice. The modal question I asked was, how does Jonah express this resistance throughout the narrative? Jonah expresses it through a prayer that sounds faithful on the surface, but is actually accusatory, and through his decision to leave the city and wait to see what will happen. This question matters because resistance to God can sometimes outwardly appear religious, if that makes any sense. The definitional question I asked was, what does true obedience look like in light of God's mercy? Jonah obeys God's command to preach, but he does not share God's compassion. This question clarifies that obedience involves more than correct actions. It requires a heart aligned with God's purposes. And finally, the implicational question I asked was, what does this passage demand of the reader? This question presses the text into the listener's life. It challenges us to consider whether we celebrate God's mercy only when it benefits people like us, or whether we are willing to embrace God's compassion for all. The answers and inferences drawn from these questions led directly to my homiletical idea, Right theology, wrong heart. Jonah chapter 4 shows us that knowing the right things about God does not automatically mean our hearts are aligned with God. The book ends with God asking Jonah a question and leaving the response open, inviting the reader to examine their own response to God's mercy. This observation, the questions that flow from it, and the resulting homiletical idea help move the sermon beyond explanation and toward transformation, which is the ultimate goal of preaching. Thank you.